So a word about tonight's format. With all the deadlines now passed, the leadership contest is now truly on, and it's in its last 3 weeks. It's fair to say that all the contestants are now under a bright spotlight, and everything they say and do will be pertinent to their success with their leadership bid. So we wanted to give the contestants a chance to really showcase themselves, so to speak. While we have prepared questions for Dimitri, we're first going to give him 10 to 15 minutes to tell us about who he is as a leader and how his life experience informs his leadership style. We also want to let you know that all these events will be recorded for posterity and will be available on YouTube and the EDA's Facebook pages. And those EDAs would be NIPR, SGI, and KLC. So Dimitri, thank you for joining us tonight. We know that the demands on all you contestants are pretty intense now that the race is fully underway and soon will be nearing its end. And we truly appreciate your making time for us tonight. But with barely 3 weeks left in the race and with 8 confirmed contestants on the ballot, we'd like to know, will you be conducting your campaign any differently over these last few weeks? And after we've heard from you on that for 2 or 3 minutes, the floor is yours for the next 10 to 15 to tell us why you are the person we should choose as our next leader. And we're going to interject at around the 12-minute mark and let you know the time, and you can wind down what you have to say. And then we will do some questions. So Dimitri, it's your floor. Take it away. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I wasn't being allowed to unmute. Thank you. Now I'm there. So Mark, thank you for that introduction. For the record, you noted at the outset that this was a call in relation to the BC Leadership Contest. So I just want to make sure that I'm in the right Zoom call.
Oh, gee, my mistake. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Yeah, I wonder if this is the right Zoom call.
No, we better. Many of us are involved in both, so it gets a little confusing.
I get confused all the time. So the other sort of detail, I'm getting a message from Susan in the chat asking me if I have an assistant who should be unmuted, but it says that my chat is disabled. So I just wanted to let you know that in case anybody wants to communicate with me by chat. Apparently I'm not able to do that right now.
Can you tell us, do you have a campaign manager or someone from your campaign with you?
I don't. I didn't want to burden my campaign team with something on this long weekend, so I'm here alone. But if anybody wants to communicate with me by chat, I would need to be to have the chat feature enabled. I'll leave that to you. Let me begin by acknowledging that I am on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I live in Old Montreal, what is now called Old Montreal, but they are the real and authentic custodians of this land, and I'm privileged to live here today and to come to you from Kanien'kehá:ka territory. I am, although living now in Montreal, born and raised in Southern Ontario, in London, Ontario to be exact. Spent a little more than half of my life there, but also lived in Vancouver for a year. Toronto, I went to law school there and lived there for a time afterwards, and now Montreal. And I also lived in New York City and Paris, and I'll be getting into that a little more detail in a moment. The way I ended up being raised in London, Ontario is that my 2 parents, who have now passed away, came to Canada from Greece in the 1950s as immigrants from Greece. They had no education at a high school level. They had really no capacity to speak English at the time, and very little money. They came not because they had a desire to leave Greece. They came because Greece was devastated by a extraordinarily brutal Nazi occupation, followed by a civil war, and they had no real economic opportunities available to them, and the Canadian government kindly afforded to them an opportunity to come and live in Canada. And so they came on a ship that was sponsored by the government from Europe to Halifax, where they disembarked and eventually meandered down by train to Montreal, and then Toronto, and finally London, Ontario. And the whole extended family ended up congregating there eventually. By the time I was born in 1963, all of my uncles and aunts, and I had quite a few of them, from my mother's and father's side, were living in London, Ontario, and raising their kids there. And my parents started working in a McCormick's biscuit factory in East London, and eventually, with their brothers and sisters, scrounged together enough money to open up a Greek diner, which is pretty much what all Greek immigrants did back in those days, it seems. And so I grew up in a Greek diner, and did all kinds of jobs when I was a teenager. Managed to myself save enough money to go to university because my parents weren't in a position to fund that, and went to University of Western Ontario undergrad, and then University of Toronto Law School in 1998, and graduated in 1991 with distinction, and was afforded the opportunity to go and work in New York City, where I'd never lived. And I was excited and intrigued by that, but also looking for the quickest way to discharge my considerable student debts. And that was the best job I could find. So I arrived there in 1991 and worked at a firm called Salmon, where I represented major financial institutions and multinational corporations, including, I think, probably the client to which I devoted most of my efforts was Goldman Sachs, the main client of the firm. And after 2 years of doing that work, which was, for me, frankly, a soul-crushing experience, it was not really an environment that I felt comfortable in. Everybody seemed to come from an Ivy League law school. There were a lot of white male lawyers who had a Roman numeral at the end of their name. I just didn't feel like I belonged in that environment. I certainly didn't find the work to be satisfying. The most interesting thing I managed to do in my first 2 years in New York City, despite the firm's commitment to serving the corporate community, it also had a very strong tradition of pro bono work. And so we were encouraged, as a matter of fact, to not only devote 80 hours a week to our corporate clients, but also to devote significant time to representing the indigent. And I and two other associates took on a case on behalf of an inmate of a federal penitentiary by the name of Charlie Velez, who had been brutalized by the prison guards. And we brought a case against the state of New York under the civil rights legislation, federal civil rights legislation. And we took it to trial in my second year and managed to secure a verdict for Charlie. Unfortunately, the jury awarded him $1 in damages, which for me was quite a shock. That the jury could determine that this person who had just a terribly tragic background became involved in criminal activity because of substance abuse, ended up in the federal penitentiary, was brutalized by prison guards, and they thought that his suffering and the violation of his rights, which they acknowledged to have happened, was worth precisely $1. So that was kind of a wake-up call to me to get out. And so I asked the firm to transfer me to their Paris office in my second year, and they granted my request. And I went there and I found a very different way of organizing the society. This was 1993. It was still at that stage very much the France of François Mitterrand, the socialist president. It was a country where labor rights were taken seriously relative to what I had seen in the United States, where activism in the organized labor movement was commonplace. It was really a feature of the culture, where there was a much better balance between professional life and personal life. There was much better environmental protection. I didn't see nearly as much poverty as I had seen in New York City. And when I finished my 2-year term in Paris and I was asked to return to the New York office, I declined. I couldn't go back to that life. It didn't hold any attraction for me. And so eventually I returned to Canada and went to the other side. And rather than represent corporations, I approached a class action law firm based in Southern Ontario, Siskins LLP, which was one of the leading class action firms in the country and still is, and told them that I wanted to take on corporate Canada using my experience as a corporate lawyer. And they were very excited by the opportunity because at the time there was a tremendous amount of, well, there still is to this day, but certainly back then, a tremendous amount of fraud going on in the stock markets in Canada. Some of you may recall the Briex scandal, a gold company that was entirely fraudulent. And when it collapsed back in, I think, 1999, $6 billion of market capitalization evaporated. Not a single executive or director was held criminally liable. There were the various scandals that were occurring on the Vancouver Stock Exchange. David Dodge, who was at that time the governor of the Bank of Canada, described Canada's stock markets as the Wild West of lax securities regulation, which is precisely what they were. There was even less oversight of our stock markets than in the United States. So the firm said to me, we think there's an opportunity here. We're going to give you whatever resources you need to build a team of lawyers to take on stock market fraudsters. And I eventually, within the space of about 5 years, thanks to the firm's support, built up a team of 15 lawyers based in 4 cities: London, Ontario, Toronto, Montreal, and Quebec City. Many of them we recruited from Bay Street law firms, which wasn't easy because Bay Street law firms were able to pay them higher salaries than we were. But it wasn't hard to find really talented young lawyers on Bay Street who were not finding the work professionally satisfying and who were prepared to take a pay cut in pursuit of a mission in which they believed. And a lot of people in the legal profession, especially the younger lawyers on Bay Street, found the mission of our firm, which was to hold corporate Canada accountable, was one in which they believed. And so it wasn't actually particularly difficult, despite the economic disadvantages we had relative to Bay Street law firms, to recruit people. And eventually our team recovered about $500 million from major Canadian corporations, including SNC Lavalin, in connection with its corruption scandal, Manulife in connection with some misrepresentations that occurred during the financial crisis, the big 6 banks. And as a result of my work, I was recognized in 2012 by Canadian Lawyer Magazine as one of the 25 most influential lawyers in Canada. And the following year by Canadian Business Magazine as one of the 50 most influential lawyers in Canadian business. Not because I acted for corporations, but I think because the editors of the magazine believed that our team had achieved a level of accountability for corporate Canada that hadn't previously existed. So by the time I got to 2015, I was at 52. I was in a position where I didn't need to make an income anymore from the practice of law. I was financially secure. And so I decided to leave class actions practice in Siskins and began to devote myself principally to doing pro bono legal work, representing people who couldn't afford a lawyer, especially in matters relating to human rights. And the reason why I decided to do that is because in my experiences as a litigator in Canada, I was astonished at how often I encountered in the legal system Canadians who couldn't afford a lawyer and who were trying to navigate the complexities of the courts right across the country, not just in Ontario, but in BC, Alberta, Quebec, without the benefit of counsel because they simply couldn't afford legal counsel. And one thing that is not talked about nearly enough in this country is that we have a crisis in our legal system of access. Most Canadians cannot afford adequate legal counsel, and as a result of that, the promise of due process is a theory, not a reality. If you, as a citizen, in what is today an extraordinarily complex legal environment, do not have capable counsel to advise you, and you're litigating a matter against a corporate entity, oftentimes that has an army of lawyers at its disposal, you are tremendously disadvantaged. No matter what efforts the judge may make to level the playing field, you ultimately are not going to achieve justice in most cases without adequate counsel. So it seemed to me that that was something I should devote myself to, and I've done now several thousand hours of pro bono legal work. Frankly, for me, that's been the most satisfying work I've done in my career.
Dimitri, if I could just interject, we're at the 12-minute mark. And
Okay.
yeah, very, very good to hear about your professional experiences, especially in the legal system. But we would like to hear just a bit about why you feel you would make the best candidate to become the leader of the Green Party, which, as you know, stands for a great deal more than just justice and fairness in that dimension of our society.
So, and I'll get right to that question. To me, it is quite clear that the reason why we don't have a resolution, or even haven't seriously embarked on a resolution of the climate emergency, is because it's not because we don't know what the solutions are. It's not because the technology is not available to affect the transition to a renewable energy economy, a sustainable economy. It's because the corporate sector has a stranglehold on the political system and on the media and on the legal system. And ultimately, any transformative agenda that is going to address in a serious way the climate emergency and the other crises that we confront and the profound level of social injustice in our society, any agenda that is truly designed to achieve that is going to encounter ferocious resistance from corporate Canada and from the billionaire class. That's the obstacle. And what we need in the party, in my view, is somebody who has an understanding of how corporate control works in this country and who has lengthy experience in overcoming that resistance and a demonstrated record of being able to do so. So I think that's not the only thing that I offer in this leadership contest amongst an extraordinary field of candidates. But to me, that is an absolutely essential quality that a leader will need to bring to bear if we're going to ultimately deal with the climate emergency about which we all care so deeply. So I think that's ultimately, and that is what persuaded me to enter this race. It's a question of us versus the corporate community and the billionaire class. And I think that I'm well situated to take that fight on.
Great. Well, thank you so much for putting yourself forward in what is clearly a very passionate way. You've certainly shown us that social justice is right up front and center for you.
Thank you.
At this point, we'd like to open up the chat for questions from our attendees. So we do have some questions prepared, so I don't want you to worry, Dimitri, that we're going to run out of things to talk about. But we'd like to give our attendees a chance to ask you questions directly. So we do have a lot of people on this call. How many? We got 48 so far. So I'm going to ask folks to please just post one question in the chat and hopefully give everybody who wants to a chance to get a question in there. But while we're waiting for people to enter their questions into the chat, I can start off with one for you, which kind of stems out of some of what you've said, but expands from there. In the light of the current fiscal deficit spawned by COVID-19, what are your priorities for a realistic socioeconomic recovery plan?
Well, I think I'd like to first address, Mark, the whole question of deficit spending. You know, I am a proponent of a theory of economics known as modern monetary theory. And essentially, the premise of modern monetary theory is that a state that has control over its own currency, as Canada does, and whose debts are denominated principally or exclusively in that currency, as Canada's are, can never go broke because it can always generate enough currency to service its debt. And the only economic constraint on the central bank of our country or any other similar jurisdiction you know, generating currency to fund important social programs is the risk of inflation. And that risk would only arise in circumstances where the economy is operating at full capacity. That is not where we are. We're not even close to operating at full capacity. And so I don't think the deficits for this country at this time or for the foreseeable future pose any kind of a threat to the economy, to our fiscal health. And rather than be talking about balancing our budget, what we should be talking about is doing everything it takes to deal with a crisis that threatens the future of our children. So even if you don't ascribe to this theory, I want to say very clearly, you know, even if you don't believe that using the powers of the Bank of Canada to generate currency to fund socially productive programs or environmentally protective programs is an option that's available to us, there are huge sources of funding that are available to us. So for example, the preferential treatment that we accord to investment income in this country. So we all know capital gains are taxed at only half of capital gains are taxable. this is a system of taxation which favors the wealthy because poor Canadians, working poor Canadians, and even middle-class Canadians don't have significant money to invest. Many people in this country are living paycheck to paycheck. So a system of preferential treatment for investment income is favoring the affluent. If we were to treat investment income the same way we treat employment income, that would generate $75 billion a year, approximately, for the federal government. We're spending $32 billion a year as of 2018 on what we call national defense, which, by the way, I don't think is actually defense. I think our military has adopted a more offensive posture than defensive posture, but that's another subject. In any event, we don't need to be spending $32 billion a year on what we call defense. So I've called for a 50% reduction in military spending. We are spending several billion dollars a year on fossil fuel subsidies. We have a top marginal tax rate that is well below historical levels. For much of the post-World War II period, it was in excess of 90%, not just in Canada, but even in the United States, which is hardly a socialist country. So I'm calling for increasing the top marginal tax rate. Under my proposal, this would apply to income in excess of $500,000 a year to 75%. So even if we don't embrace the theory of modern monetarists, that the Bank of Canada can generate the currency to fund these programs, we have ample fiscal space by reforming our tax system and making the wealthy pay their fair share to fund the kinds of programs we need going forward. And ultimately, what we need to do going forward, a whole bunch of things. We need to ensure that there are no Canadians falling through the cracks through a guaranteed livable income. There's absolutely no excuse for a country as wealthy as Canada to have homeless people, to have children living in poverty, and there are millions who are. There's absolutely no excuse in this country either for there to be 10 Canadians who are controlling $65 billion of wealth. This extreme wealth that is currently possessed by so few people is being used by those individuals to bend the political and legal system to their will and to block the changes that we need. So
Dimitri,
I think, yeah.
Yeah, clearly this is another area of great passion for you, and it certainly opens up a lot more discussion. But I would like to, with time so limited, give our attendees a chance to fire some questions at you as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask Helena to come online and present a question. Helena?
Okay, so this question from the chat, I believe is following up on your previous statements where you said that one thing that you can bring to the Green Party as leader is your understanding of how to navigate the corporate world. So this question is, how would you propose to battle the corporate world, and would proportional representation help in this?
Yes, so proportional representation would help in every aspect of a progressive agenda, because the composition of Parliament would reflect the political diversity of this country, and progressives would have far more representation in Parliament than they currently do. How would I propose to battle the corporate sector? Through a variety of methods, and not just the corporate sector, but it's also the ultra wealthy. First of all, I think that we need to break the grip of the ultra wealthy on the media. So I would propose that we use our anti-competition laws in order to break up major media, corporate media corporations, principally Post Media, which owns in excess of a third of the newspapers in this country and has a quite distinct right-wing agenda. I would propose to increase tax rates on the ultra wealthy and actually to tax billionaires out of existence. I think we should have wealth caps in this country. I think we have to place an iron lock on the revolving door between the regulatory community and the corporate sector, because so many of our regulators, including in the oil industry, including the stock markets, have been captured by the industries that they are intended to regulate. And the reason why is because you have people passing through the regulatory community, entering the private sector, and then gaining lucrative employment. And this affects their willingness to take on the corporate sector in their regulatory capacity. I think we need to put much more serious constraints on private financing of elections. Here in Quebec, where I live, the maximum donation is $100. And there's much more robust funding of public funding of political parties. This is a system that I think we should adopt nationally, where we have much, much lower campaign contribution limits and much more robust public funding. Another thing we have to do, is the legal system. We have to address the crisis of access to justice. And I think we should be imposing a tax on corporate litigants who disproportionately use a justice system that is funded by taxpayers to fund the representation of Canadians who cannot afford a lawyer. I also think that we should be taxing the legal profession in order to fund the representation of lawyers, of individuals who cannot afford a lawyer. I could go on and on. There's a whole range of proposals that we need to implement, in my view, in order to constrain the power of corporate Canada and of the billionaire class, and ensure that the politics of this country reflect the will of the public.
Great. Well, let's move on to another question from one of our attendees and see where that takes us. Harold, do you have a question ready?
I do, yes. Dimitri, one of our, I guess, members or participants says, as leader, how would you address the rift between the Green Party supporters who stand on different sides of the political spectrum? And it sort of goes into maybe what you were just talking about a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there is a rift. It's not unusual for the Green Party. I think you find in every single political party in this country a spectrum of views. There's a left wing of the Liberal Party and a right wing of the Liberal Party, same thing in the NDP and even in the Conservative Party. I think the way we unify the party is by finding what we believe, the views that we have in common, and rallying around those views. One thing that I think is broadly attractive to people within the Green Party, even though they may have disparate views about economic regulation and the organization of our society, is the idea that it is unacceptable for there to be, 10 people who are controlling $65 billion of wealth. Extreme wealth is a problem or a crisis, an injustice that really resonates with a lot of people, including people who I think would situate themselves on the center of the political spectrum and even some on the right. I think the idea that we shouldn't have homeless people in this country and even poverty in this country is one that broadly appeals to people in the Green Party of Canada, including those on the right of the political spectrum and those on the left. I think that there is broad-based support for the idea that we should be prioritizing a transition to a renewable energy economy over military spending. I'm not saying every single Green agrees with that, but I think that's something that the vast majority of Greens, including those who would position themselves as centrists, or even on the right of the Green political spectrum, would agree with. So I think we have to find focus on what binds us and rally around those core principles and programs. Not everybody at the end of the day may be on board with that kind of an agenda, but I think that there is, tremendous support within the party for a very strongly progressive position. And the last thing I'll say on that is that this is borne out by polling evidence. In the last election, I talk about this poll often. Forum Research asked Canadians how they feel about socialism. 58% of Canadians said they have a positive view, and 69% of those who identified as Green Party supporters, over 2/3, said they have a positive view of socialism. And a substantial majority said they had a negative view of capitalism within the party. Is everybody on board with that? No, but I think that there is overwhelming support for the idea that we need a much more progressive economy and to concentrate much less wealth in the hands of the few.
Well, Dimitri, one of the things that frustrates a lot of us Greens is that we have so much presence in politics, in Parliament. So a lot of the ideas you're putting forward here are very far-reaching and certainly would be extremely challenging to the status quo. So how do you propose getting some real action on some of these big ideas with only 3 Green MPs? How do you see that playing out?
Well, with the greatest of respect to people who have been involved in the formulation of our electoral strategy in the past, I think the reason why we have only 3 Green MPs is because we haven't proposed these far-reaching ideas. I think that's the path to growth. The Liberal Party is firmly ensconced in the center, or what is called today the center of the political spectrum. The NDP has gravitated to the center, started with Layton, accelerated under Mulcair. Jagmeet Singh is firmly ensconced there today. There's a vacuum on the political left. There is tremendous appetite for these types of policies. And I think the proof of that, or one indication of it at any rate, is that my workers' rights platform, which talks about limiting the spread between executive compensation and worker compensation, a $20 minimum wage, mandatory representation of workers on the boards of corporations. All of this is outside of the NDP platform. And after I published my workers' rights platform, Sid Ryan, who is the president of the former president of the Ontario Federation of Labor, endorsed me as a candidate. This is a former NDP candidate who almost ran as leader for the NDP, and said he's never seen anything like this in his lifetime for the federal NDP or any provincial NDP. He has recognized, as many others have, that there is a vacuum on the progressive end of the political spectrum. And if we want to grow this party, it's precisely by putting forward, in my view, this type of a bold program.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you very much for that response. Helena, we're looking for another question from the people online. What have you got for us?
To follow up with that question, another one from the participants from the chat says, it seems to me that a large reason for the rift in the party is the concern over what the best approach to win people over from other parties is. If you were chosen to lead the party, what would be your strategy for winning over the progressive voters from other parties?
Thank you for your question, Kim. I've already, I won't repeat what I said, but I've already touched on a key part of my strategy, which is to make this party, the Green Party of Canada, the champion of working Canadians. That's precisely why I think we should be putting forward a platform which protects workers in insolvencies. One thing I didn't mention is, under my proposals, the claims of workers in corporate insolvencies would be prioritized over those of hedge funds and other secured creditors. That's why I proposed a $20 minimum wage, a cap on executive compensation, mandatory representation of workers on the boards of public companies. These things have caused large numbers of persons, and I know this from having having interacted with new members of the party, to come over from the NDP and the progressive wing of the Liberal Party. And I've got people on my campaign team who, devoted their lives to the Liberal Party, devoted their lives to the NDP, and are frustrated with the centrist orientation of those parties, and sometimes even right-leaning orientation of those parties. To me, there is a hunger within the progressive community in this country, which I think happens to constitute a majority of Canadians, for bold representation. That's how we're going to bring them all together. And I think we've seen this happening in our own campaign. We had in the last week, our best result ever in the entire campaign in terms of fundraising and number of donors. We had never had a week that even came close to that. I think we got something like 700 new donors within the last week, raised over $30,000. Because the message is resonating with people. People are coming from all over the political, spectrum, but they're all people of a progressive orientation in order to join with our party. So to me, the tent we should be trying to build is the progressive tent. That's the natural constituency for this party.
Well, that's very heartening news.
Do you mind if I ask a question just to follow up on that, Mark?
Yeah.
Dimitri, wouldn't that put us then fighting over the same territory with the NDP? Does that not make it a little more difficult for us if we're fighting against them for people to vote for us?
I think the NDP has abandoned that.
Okay, that's what you're trying to. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is what I'm hearing from people in the NDP, that they're frustrated with the leadership's determination to position the party in the center of the political spectrum, that they're fed up. So I think that space is unoccupied.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Harold, can you present us another question from the people online?
Okay, let me find something here. Yeah, I guess one of the questions here is, Green parties the world over were formed largely to address environmental and climate issues. Would you maintain that primary focus, is the question.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The question I think we have to grapple with is, how are we going to achieve the solution? And I think that if we don't accept, as Naomi Klein has so passionately and eloquently argued for years, that the core cause of the climate emergency is this inhumane, ruthless, and extraordinarily unequal economic system, then we aren't going to ultimately resolve the climate emergency. We have an economic system which richly rewards people for externalizing the cost of their production and retaining the profits for themselves. This is how the billionaires in our country became billionaires. Either they inherited their wealth or they externalized the costs of their corporate entities' production and kept the profits for themselves. So we need, and then what they do is they take this massive wealth that they've accumulated by foisting on all of the innocents the cost of their production, and they use it to block the transformative changes that we need. So I absolutely am going to prioritize resolution of the climate emergency, but I'm saying that the real cause of it is the economic system. And you mentioned, Harold, you talked about the origins of the Green Party of Canada. You know, one of the Green Party figures whom I admire the most is Petra Kelly, you know, founder or co-founder of the German Green Movement. And Petra Kelly was somebody who devoted herself to demilitarization. She was absolutely committed to this, and it was a huge part of her advocacy, both inside and outside of politics. Why did she do that? A big part of the reason why she did that is because militarism is an enormous obstacle to resolution of the climate emergency. Militarism causes countries to expend scarce resources on weapons of destruction rather than on a transition to a renewable energy economy. Militaries have a massive carbon footprint. Militaries create enormous tension, geopolitical instability, which impedes the kind of international cooperation we need to deal with this quintessentially international crisis. And Petra Kelly was very passionate about demilitarization. You know, in the last election, our party, as far as I can tell, I read the platform carefully several times. I did not see anywhere in that platform a call for a reduction in military spending. I think it's absolutely essential that we drastically reduce military spending and reallocate those funds to the transition to a renewable energy economy. There is no threat confronting this country today of a military nature that is remotely comparable to the threat posed by the climate emergency. So I would say that my approach is actually one that resonates or is more consistent with the foundational principles of the green movement around the world than perhaps the current orientation of the party is.
Dimitri, as you know, we have very, very few years to deal with this climate crisis. So if your approach is to tackle the corporate world, do you really believe that that thrust will be achievable, given that we've got, what, 4 or 5 years before we really have passed the point of no return as far as a warming planet goes?
Well, I would say to you that if we don't tackle the corporate world, there's no way we're going to resolve the climate emergency. I mean, why are we not there?
What about all the other proposals that have been bandied about now for quite a few years? Things like carbon caps, carbon taxes, transforming society to a green basis, electrification, a national energy grid. There's a lot of that in the green platform. And I haven't heard anything about that expressed by you as yet.
Well, I would recommend you look. If you have some time, look at our ecology platform, our environmental platform, which talks about all those things. Of course, I strongly support a robust price for carbon, and I've gone further than that. I've taken the position that we actually need to place hard limits on greenhouse gas emissions nationally, declining year over year. That we need to impose a ban on all new oil and gas exploration. We can't even exploit the currently identified resources without wrecking the planet. So why do we allow fossil fuels corporations to invest billions of dollars in developing yet more deposits? I'm talking about a complete ban on all oil and gas infrastructure. So these are the things. This is I think as assertive a platform as you're going to encounter on the Canadian political scene in terms of dealing assertively with the climate crisis. What I'm saying is that we need to combine that in order to implement it. We need to combine that with a robust reallocation of wealth and power within our society. Otherwise, we're never going to be in a position to get there, to implement those changes. I don't see another way around it. I think that the corporate resistance is exactly what stopped us from achieving that type of a transformation.
So on another topic altogether, what do you say about increasing the diversity of the Green Party to bring not just different points of view socioeconomically, but people of different sexual orientations, women, people of color? Those elements are not strongly represented in our party, certainly not in the leadership echelon. So how do you view that, and what do you propose to do there?
Well, yeah, it's not just in the leadership echelon. As many of you will know, there was a survey done in the last election by the National Observer, I believe it was, which asked the parties to identify the proportion of candidates which came from racialized communities. And the Green Party, according to their results, had the lowest proportion of candidates who came from racialized communities, even lower than the People's Party of Canada. So it's not just the leadership, it's the candidate pool. And I think that our shadow cabinet has not reflected the religious, gender, and racial diversity of this country. And I could go on and on. So I think this is an absolutely critical issue for us to grapple with as a party. One of our core values is respect for diversity, and rightly so. I think that first thing we have to do is actually speak to the hearts and minds of people from oppressed communities, including racialized groups within this country, by putting forward a platform which addresses their core concerns. And so that's what I've tried to do in my own platform with the justice reform. We're calling for defunding the police the RCMP by 50%, and reallocating those monies to social services. This is in line with the position of Black Lives Matter Toronto with respect to defunding the police of Toronto. They're calling for a 50% reduction. We are calling for a reform of the way in which we choose judges in this country so that they reflect the religious, gender, and racial diversity of the Canadian population. We're calling for the federal government to maintain statistics on which racialized communities are being most targeted by police brutality, which they don't currently do. The Civilian Complaints and Review Board of which is supposed to be supervising the RCMP, doesn't even publish the majority of its results with respect to investigations into police brutality. So we've called for that information to be made public so people can see exactly what is being alleged against the law enforcement community in this country. These types of programs, I think, will get members of racialized communities excited about, the prospects for real change under a Green Party government. And so I think we ultimately have to listen to what these oppressed communities are telling us, what they want to see from a government, and we need to deliver something that we haven't done as well as we could have in the past.
Great. Well, thank you, Dimitri. Some very compelling points there. Harold, have you got another question for us?
Yeah, I do. Many Canadians have lost jobs in this COVID crisis. And when it comes to election time, other parties go to the jobs, jobs, jobs logo. How do we convince Canadians that the Green Party can provide good jobs for people?
Well, yeah, I mean, probably the place where this is the most, concern is the province of Alberta, which is not only dealing with an economic crisis occasioned by the pandemic, but also an industry which is a major driver of the Alberta economy is being devastated, the fossil fuels industry. So with respect to Alberta in particular, there is a report that was published, leaked, I should say, not published, from the Alberta Energy Regulator, which showed that the remediation of orphan wells, decaying fossil fuels infrastructure, and tar sands tailings ponds would cost upwards of $260 billion. And this was way above the public estimate that the Alberta Energy Regulator was sharing with Albertans. And some people think that even that number is too low, that it's actually going to be much higher. And despite this fact, the Alberta Energy Regulator has collected, I think, less than $2 billion of security from the industry, so that when these companies have fully exploited their resources and they go away, there'll be no money there for the cleanup. So I think that we need to, with respect to Alberta in particular, we need to generate a reclamation jobs boom by taxing year after year the fossil fuels industry to fund the remediation of orphan wells and decaying infrastructure and tar sands tailings ponds. 200, Avi Lewis and Reagan Poychuk, a researcher from Alberta, co-authored an op-ed in the Toronto Star in which they described this as a reclamation jobs boom. This would provide high quality jobs for decades to come. And Alberta's workers who are already trained, many of whom are already trained to do this type of work, would be working to restore the environment to its natural state rather than participating in the destruction of the environment. So I think for Alberta, a reclamation jobs boom should be front and center of the Green Party's program. And we have to force the industry through an appropriate system of taxation to fund that jobs boom. More broadly, I think our country should be looking at massive investment, a Green New Deal type of investment, a Marshall Plan type of investment in the transition to a renewable energy economy. So that will mean massive government expenditure on retrofitting buildings around the country, massive government expenditure on public transportation. One thing I think we should absolutely be championing is a high-speed rail system within the Windsor to Quebec City corridor, also from Calgary to Edmonton, and perhaps in other parts of the country. We should be investing massively. The government should be doing this. It has the means to do it in developing an electric charging network around the country of a world-class caliber, in developing manufacturing facilities for solar panels, other solar energy infrastructure, wind turbines. This is going to take an everything that we can bring to the table type of approach, and the government has the capacity to do that. And it's been shown that investment in renewable energy per dollar generates substantially more employment than every dollar of investment in fossil fuels. So if we take this crisis on seriously, we can generate massive amounts of employment for decades to come in this country.
Yeah,
but the
for
government,
many of us, sorry, Dimitri, I just wanted to say for many of us Greens, these points are pretty familiar because they're right out of the playbook of our policy manual. I'd like to shift the question to something really specific to BC, and that concerns our salmon and herring fisheries that are in near collapse here. We are facing the lowest sockeye return ever in history in the Fraser River. It used to be something upwards of 100 million fish returning there pre-contact, and this year it's somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 DFO is estimated, which is almost nothing. So this is a really controversial, very big issue, particularly here on the coast. I'd like to hear, and I'm sure many of us would like to hear your views on this and what you propose to do to help bring some real change to this ongoing dilemma.
well, I think we have to constrain we have to drastically lower the amounts of fishing that is going on in our coastal waters and our inland rivers. I mean, I don't really think that there's any solution other than massively reducing our consumption levels and our exploitation of fish stocks. So to me, that would be the central point in dealing with this crisis. I just don't see any other way around that.
There are many other causes, of course, climate change being a huge one with changing ocean conditions. Logging, which has deforested river valleys and caused unbelievable sedimentation of spawning beds. Salmon farms is a hugely controversial issue here on the coast, which are known to have a very deleterious effect on wild stocks. So some of these things are very much under provincial control. Some of them have some federal oversight, but so far very, very little concrete has been done despite promises from other parties. The NDP and the Liberals, for two, have said that they want to get the farms out of the water, but nothing much has happened. So how do you see us Greens making a real difference?
Well, I think that ultimately we're going to have to acquire more power within Parliament and the provincial legislatures in order for us to make a difference. I think the solutions are largely known. The problem we have is an absence of political will amongst the existing mainstream parties, including the NDP and the Liberals. I think that's quite clear federally, and it's quite clear provincially. So I don't think it's really a question of not knowing how to deal with the problem and address it. It's a problem of getting enough Green MPs and MLAs into the provincial legislatures and the federal government in order to make the solutions a reality. And I come back to what I've said, and I'll say many times, is that I think the way to do that is by boldly occupying the progressive end of the political spectrum and offering a program that no other party is putting forward to the progressive community in this country.
Mm. Yeah, well, the trick is going to be building a strong alliance to bring enough consensus to really have some powerful say in these matters. It certainly isn't due to a lack of interest among Greens, but how to bring that to bear on the power structure such as it is. And that will be a huge job for whoever becomes the leader.
Yeah.
So Dimitri, our time is drawing to a close. I'd like to give you a couple of minutes to just wrap up what you've been saying, make some closing remarks, and yeah, just take that away.
Thank you very much. You know, the Green Party is the first party I ever joined in my political life, my life period, back in 2007. It is the only party for which I have ever run as a candidate, and for the leadership, it is the only party in which I've ever held an official position. I was the Justice Critic in the Green Party Shadow Cabinet in 2016, Justice Critic in the Green Party of Quebec Shadow Cabinet from 2018, and CEO of the London West EDA. And the reason why I have committed so much of my life and my activities to this party is because these 6 core values really define my view of the world. And what I'd like to see is whoever ultimately emerges as the leader in this contest is a concerted effort to demonstrate to Canadians that we're not only about the environment, that we also are equally committed to respect for diversity, social justice, nonviolence, and participatory democracy. And to me, you know, committing ourselves to be the champions of all of those values and convincing Canadians that that's what we are is the path to growth for this party, whoever may emerge as the leader ultimately. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And I want to just conclude by saying that if you're willing to spend an hour talking to me on Labor Day weekend, it can only mean that you are politically engaged Canadians, and I commend you for your political engagement. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Dimitri. It was really wonderful to hear you express so clearly some of the things that are closest to your heart.
Thank you.
I really appreciate how you wrap things up by referencing our 6 guiding principles, because that is what binds Greens together around the world. And like you, that's what drew me to this party as well. One of our challenges is to really actualize those principles in our day-to-day living and in our day-to-day operating as a political entity, so that we don't succumb to backbiting and tearing each other apart and condemning and criticizing and all those old things. So that's a challenge, and I really appreciate the tone with which you wrapped it up.
Thank you,
So
Mark.
I also want to wind up by thanking the people who put so much effort into bringing this series together. The 3 EDAs from Saanich Gulf Islands, that's especially Harold Hummel and Helena Murray Hill, and from Kelowna Lake Country, Travis Ashley, and from North Island-Powell River, Susan Short and Megan Ardyke. These people and their close collaboration and their commitment to the Green Party is what allowed us to do this and to have all of you contestants join us. So thanks again, Dimitri, and
Thank you.
thank you, everyone. Please bear in mind that our next one in the series of these 8 meetings will be held via Zoom. It will be with Annemie Paul, another contestant, and it is tomorrow at 2 p.m. Pacific time. So there's an opportunity to meet another very strong candidate, and hopefully it'll help us all decide what to do in 3 weeks when the time comes to vote. So thanks, everyone.